here with Professor Kinney. Professor Kinney, I'm really excited to talk to you about the work you've been doing in gender identity issues. And I first saw your work. You worked with Sasha Ayad and Lisa Marciano and a couple of other co-authors. And I was wondering if you could talk about that paper and then some of the other research you've done about rapid onset gender dysphoria.
The paper that we've just recently had published in the Archives of Sexual Behaviour was a paper that is trying to highlight the methodological flaws in the pro-transgender lobby research. And it's very concerning that these very flawed studies are actually coming to incorrect conclusions. And, parents and other health practitioners are relying on the outcomes of research studies to help them make decisions about, children presenting with gender dysphoria. So my colleagues and I are very concerned that we need to raise awareness of the serious flaws in some of these studies and the erroneous conclusions that they're drawing. So that was the most recent paper.
And those methodological flaws are so profound, but for people who aren't well versed in research, it might be really confusing for them. So I was wondering if you talk about some of the flaws, like the self-reporting, self-selection of participants, the way in which the questions might be skewed, and the way in which the data even is calculated. Would you be willing to sort of talk about those methodological flaws?
Well, how participants are selected for studies, and quite often the studies are based on internet, doing a survey over the internet, and if you select people who are already pro-trans or already have children who have transitioned, or the children who have transitioned themselves, you're not sampling a representative sample. You've got a skewed sample or a biased sample. And of course, if they've already embraced the transgender ideology, they're going to report their own experience in a positive way. So that's one of the big issues that we find with these transgender affirming studies, that the samples they use and the sample sizes are very inadequate. A second problem that we have is that many studies, if not most, don't have long-term follow-up of the findings that they have immediately following, their transition treatment. And of the studies that are available that have longer-term follow-up, they're much less positive than studies who only assess children as they're exiting, from a gender clinic. So there's a number of reasons for that. If the child is transitioning from female to male, which is now the vast majority, it didn't used to have a gender skew of that magnitude, but we are finding now that there are many more young women wanting to transfer to male than male to female. And one of the problems with that transition is that testosterone can have euphoric effects on an individual. It makes them feel strong and powerful, and it enhances their mood. And if you're going to then do a study on young people who are still in the throes of, this newfound happiness and kind of strength, they're obviously going to be quite positive about what they've done. But there is now enough longitudinal data to show that long-term use of testosterone has incredibly serious and often irreversible effects on the female body, one of which the destruction of their reproductive organs. The second is that if they stay on it for a long period of time, they experience enormous pain in their uterus, and it's now recommended that young people who experience this pain undergo hysterectomy, which is, terribly sad if you were born, a female and you're now only 20 or 25 years old. So young people who are in the throes of this euphoria are not thinking about the long term, that they might never be able to have children, that they might never be able to enjoy a satisfying sexual life, that they may never experience a partner, because the field, becomes quite limited once you've identified as trans male or trans female in terms of available partners. So that's the second major problem, that the long-term follow-up studies are just not there, they're just not available. So you've got the biased samples, self-selection, long-term follow-up studies not available.
And it seems like one long-term study that we have, the Swedish study,
yes.
showed really detrimental outcomes after about 10 years. Shockingly scary outcomes, that suicide rates just
very,
so high. Yeah.
Yes. So that is one of the few studies we have of a reasonable number of people representing the population over a 30-year period. It's kind of unique at the moment. But there were 324 people who actually underwent full gender transition, and they were followed up for 30 years. And what that study found, 19 times higher than the general population matched for age and sex. So what this tells us is the myth that's perpetrated by the transgender lobby, that parents often quote, "I'd rather have a live son than a dead daughter." So the implication is, if I don't allow my child to transition, they're going to commit suicide. Now, that is a very widely propagated mantra throughout all of the transgender propaganda that we see. And in fact, it's just not true. We don't have any good research evidence that suicide is increased in children who are not transitioned for whatever reason.
Well, and even I believe the Bergstrom and Pachinkas study that just recently came out initially tried to suggest that children did better if they transitioned, but then after they reviewed the data, it looks like cross-sex hormones do not have any positive benefits. So even in the short term, we're finding not particularly good outcomes.
That's absolutely correct. And the really interesting thing is that while they're claiming benefits in the psychological domain in terms of, anxiety and depression, it apparently has no effect on the underlying gender dysphoria. So, the whole purpose for which the treatment is being propagated, it doesn't appear to improve their gender dysphoria. And that's a not a very well kept secret, that the transgender lobby literally cannot explain that, because the treatment is supposed to relieve gender dysphoria and help the young person purportedly to experience the right body, in inverted commas, and yet it doesn't do that. So yes, that study does show that even the short-term effects are nothing of all of the complications of the treatment. Young people are now, experiencing significant reductions in their bone mineral density as a result of cross-sex hormones. And there are now some animal studies that are showing that it does lead to cognitive deficits in young people, because starting them in adolescence, this is a time of major growth spurt, and one of the major times throughout the lifespan where the brain is engaging in like development, so that they, will end up with their adult brain. So it's a time of pruning and myelination and so forth. And we are now believing that injections of cross-sex hormones affects those brain processes that should be normally happening during adolescence. And there's going to be likely evidence in the near future of cognitive deficits in young people who've taken these cross-sex hormones.
That's really scary. And I know that Professor Whitehall has done some work on the limbic system and how I think he looked at puberty blockers. And it makes sense that puberty blockers would delay development, because basically that's what their goal is to induce a developmental delay. But the fact that research is coming out now to show the deleterious effects of cross-sex hormones, and they're not short-term effects. These are long-term effects. Once you lose IQ points, you don't get them back.
No, that's right. Yes, Professor Whitehall actually hasn't done that research himself, but he was reporting on research that looked at the effect of cross-sex hormones on the limbic system of sheep. And that's when the alarm bells started to ring, that we were seeing these neurological changes in the brains of sheep who were given puberty blockers and later cross-sex hormones.
Oh, it's really disturbing. So I was wondering, would you be able to kind of quantify how long that testosterone euphoria lasts? Because I've talked to detransitioners, and anywhere from like a year to 5 years out, it seems like the first year is when they're really just flying high. And then it's hard to tell whether they're still flying high after that time, or if they're just embarrassed to admit that they made a mistake because they were so insistent that this was what they needed. So physiologically, how long does it take for that testosterone high to wear off?
It's very hard to quantify that at this point. Because some of the treatment regimes differ across gender clinics and across countries. So there doesn't appear to be a completely uniform treatment method in terms of the dosage that young people start on. So some clinics start them on low doses and gradually build up. And even then, we don't know whether all clinics have maximum levels of the hormone. So that is a very variable situation at the moment, and we don't have good data to know how long those effects would last. But post 5 years, my guess is that some of the side effects are going to become extremely apparent. So, for example, there's going to be masculinization of the female genitalia. There's going to be a shrinking of the uterus and the reproductive organs. Young women who take, doses of testosterone prescribed by these gender clinics and often by private endocrinologists and even by GPs now, or some of them are sourcing it off the internet, and they're taking it in a completely unsupervised way. So it's extremely disturbing, that they're injecting these substances into their bodies that are having major effects. And many of these young people are just simply not aware of what they're doing to themselves. So one of the big issues that is very visible is that the young person develops pustular acne. And it can be very serious. It can be very disfiguring all over their face and their shoulders and their back. And that can take quite a few months to resolve. And they need a lot of treatment and antibiotics and so on to, try to help their skin recover from the effects of testosterone. That can take, 9 to 12 months, if not more. And some of the young people, are left with quite a lot of scarring. So when these effects start to kick in, young people may start to get, a little bit more distressed. The euphoria comes down and then the reality hits. So there are some irreversible effects of testosterone, including male pattern baldness, deepening of the voice. So once the voice deepens on testosterone, a female can never get back her female voice. So even if she transitions and comes back to her natal sex of female, as soon as she opens her mouth, people are going to say there's something very strange here. You know, you don't sound female. And so there's going to be all those kinds of social anxieties that I'm sure young people just gloss over and don't fully understand.
When I've
So I
talked to
hope
a
that's
number of
answered your question.
Yeah, I've talked to a number of young women who have detransitioned and their voices are low, and they say they're one of the hardest things socially for them is that people are assuming that they're males who have transitioned to be female because of their voice.
Yes.
And so they're not passing as
Yeah,
female anymore, which can be really distressing for them after they realized it was a mistake. These are lifelong consequences they have to live with.
absolutely. And some of those same young women have already had double mastectomies. So, yeah, I mean, that's irreversible. One very irresponsible pro-trans practitioner, um, Olson Kennedy, said flippantly, oh, look, it's no big deal if the girls get their breasts cut off. They can always get implants later on. You know, completely
Right,
missing the point that the breast is to nurture children and they will never be
right.
able to breastfeed a child if they ever have one.
And can you imagine saying
Um,
that about any other part of our body? Just saying, oh, it's okay, you can get it replaced if you decide it was a mistake. And the other thing is, I was just reading some of her
no,
research, and it sounds like the nipple sensation hardly ever returns after these girls have had the double mastectomies because their nipples are basically cut off and replaced. And so they're even if they do decide to get a breast implant, they're going to lose that sensation for the rest of their lives.
absolutely. And you can just imagine what happens to their genitalia after they undergo uh, I call it cross-sex surgery. The lobby calls it gender-affirming surgery. But, I have a major dispute with the language that they use. They try to make it benevolent and benign and affirming. You know, this word affirming is very problematic because so many young people don't really understand what is happening to them and they're given no safe space in which to explore it. They're pressured into, going ahead immediately with these terrible, mutilating treatments.
Well, and I'm not sure about where you live, but in the state that I live in, they actually now require therapists to affirm children with gender identity issues. So they've legislatively required therapists to push children into affirmation rather than to explore underlying causes. Have you, during your research, identified any probable underlying causes for gender dysphoria?
It essentially remains not fully known, but we know that there are certain characteristics of young people who succumb to the propaganda, to the trans activist lobbies and so on. And so what we're noticing now are some commonalities among the young women, particularly, who we describe as rapid onset gender dysphoria. So these are the young girls who at 12, 13, 14 years of age suddenly declare themselves to be transgender when there's been no indication, during their early life development that they had any issues with their gender identity. So with those young women, many of them have social skills deficits or they're very socially anxious and don't have an accepting peer group. Some of them are on the autism spectrum. And some of them have family conflict, so they don't have a safe sounding board, to talk about their concerns. And there are also young women who are very susceptible to suggestion. So, we all might watch the same piece of propaganda like, you know, vote for Trump or vote for Biden. Um, and some people will be much more easily convinced by a political argument or a social argument than others. And so young people who don't have or haven't had practice in critical thinking and reflective thinking. So if they're feeling anxious or depressed or isolated or ostracised, they also might have been bullied at school because they may have some unusual physical feature, then those young people are looking for a tribe, so to speak, you know, people who are going to embrace them and accept them and affirm them. And so those young people are going to be much more susceptible to the message than others who have a stronger sense of self and who have come from families where you know, it's okay to have disagreements and to discuss these and to work them through. So my major argument is that a lot of these young people are actually succumb to social contagion. Now, the transgender lobby are vehemently opposed to my theory of social contagion because it actually goes to the heart of their ideology, which is that it knows what your gender identity is other than the child, him or herself. And so it is for no one else to question it. And because it's such an innate, powerful sense of oneself, it can't possibly be susceptible to social contagion. Now, this is a completely flawed and factitious, you know, argument. But that's the reason that they're vehemently opposed to social contagion, even though they've got absolutely no evidence that social contagion is not a factor. And I argue that it is a major factor, not just one among many, but, you know, it has that kind of meta kind of quality that all of these young people, or almost all of them, are subject to social contagion, either from their peer groups at school, from social media, from the propaganda from the transgender lobby, and also as soon as they present to a medical facility or a hospital with severe mental health issues and they tell those people that they're transgender, then they're treated as if they are the opposite sex. And so they're affirmed immediately by these social institutions who are so supposed to protect them and to, you know, help them work through these difficulties. So social contagion is rife throughout the whole politics of transgenderism.
Well, and I think that Abigail Schreier's book really highlighted the social contagion aspect of this. And I've even seen trans activists suggest to girls, you know, if you don't like having your period, it's probably because you were born in the wrong body and you're actually male. I mean, it's gotten to the point where if a girl has any discomfort whatsoever, then it's because she was born in the wrong body. And we all know, all of us who went through puberty know that we all have had difficult times as we transition from girls into women, and that's perfectly normal. But now we have a narrative that, oh no, it's just because you're born in the wrong body, which I can't think of anything more insidious, really.
Absolutely. Look, the other thing that I forgot to mention earlier, as one of the underlying or coexisting associations of, you know, trying to identify which young women will think about transitioning, and that is young women who, if left alone, you know, to pass through puberty without having their body mutilated by cross-sex hormones, are those who may well end up being gay. And so they're confused about their sexual orientation. And the argument goes something like this, you know, at 14 or 15, a young woman says, oh no, I'm attracted to my best friend and she's a girl. That can't be right. That means I must be a boy. So if I'm a boy, I can be attracted to my best friend because she's a girl. And so they're confusing sexual orientation with gender identity to solve a developmental problem of coming to terms with their sexual orientation. So that's another factor that we need to consider with these young women.
Which is so ironic that,
struggling.
yeah, it's so ironic to me that the organization, the community, the LGB group that originally was formed to support people as they explore their sexual orientation has now been kind of co-opted by transgender activists who are now really pushing people into thinking that they're transgender rather than helping them to accept their sexual orientation.
Yes, yes, that's right. It's almost as if being gay or lesbian is passé, you know. It's just, you know, that. But the ironic thing is that the transgender lobby has piggybacked on the back of the gay lobby, you know, to get the rights that the gay community now enjoy. And so when it suits them, they conflate the two in order to have the benefits that have been hard won by the lesbian and gay community. So it's really a sleight of hand in a way, you know, that they don't allow these young people who, you know, are starting to come to terms with the fact that they may be gay. They want to just quickly, you know, tip them into, oh no, you're not gay, you're transgender, without helping them to explore that and what their feelings are about it and so on.
Increasingly, I'm also seeing transgender activists who are saying that having genital preference is transphobic. And so lesbians are told that they're not allowed to prefer biological females because that's transphobic, because there are males who are born in the wrong body and they should be treated as any other lesbian. So it's really convoluted.
It's very convoluted and very flawed. You know, the arguments are just so specious, that they're so illogical, they're so anti-science. You know, it's almost as if, you know, the hundreds of years of science that has studied, you know, human anatomy and biology has all gone out the window. You know, it's all irrelevant. Sex is not the foundational determinant. The gender, which is a social construct. And they can't see the illogicality that it doesn't matter what you do to your body, every cell in your body is going to be either male or female. It's going to, you know, contain either the male combination of chromosomes or the female. And this sexual dimorphism has been completely rejected by the transgender lobby in favour of this nonsense spectrum that they talk about, this gender spectrum. And another very dishonest thing that they've done is recruited the intersex community to support their notion that sex is not binary, it's on a spectrum. But in fact, the peak bodies who are supporting people with intersex conditions, and these medically are described as disorders of sexual development. So this is where it's acknowledged that something has gone wrong, you know, in embryonic and fetal development. But the intersex community wants nothing to do with the transgender argument, but they have recruited the intersex community to try and bolster their claim that gender and sex are dimensional on a spectrum. You know, they're not binary. So they're terribly dishonest. They're terribly anti-scientific. A lot of them, I feel, have very serious psychological difficulties that they're projecting, you know, onto the community, and wreaking havoc and revenge on a society that they perceive has done them significant harm. And this is the way that they're retaliating. So that's why it isn't a reasoned argument, because it's been propagated by people who have very little self-awareness. and have, hold on a minute, you know, let me just examine what I'm thinking here, and does it line up with science and reality?
Well, and that's pretty classic of people who have significant mental health disorders often do not realize that they're misperceiving things. And that's why we have society and therapists and doctors and teachers and parents to provide boundaries for thought. Because when people do have mental illness, they don't realize it. They sort of lack that ability, that self insight. And I feel like we've done a horrible injustice to people by allowing them to run with these ideas rather than to provide them with the kind of support that they need.
That's right, absolutely.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with my history, but I got involved with this because according to them, I was a transgender child. I met all the criteria of being insistent, consistent, and persistent. And so much so that the school psychologist was called in to evaluate me. And I'm so thankful that she didn't affirm me and say, oh, yes, your name is Timothy. Oh, yes, you can use the boys' bathroom. We'll put you on puberty blockers. Because my gender dysphoria, my body dysmorphia, this self-hatred that I had was the result of a sexual assault that happened to me when I was a child. And so when I see what's happening, it just enrages me that these kids are being denied mental health services and instead being told that that self-hatred that they have is normal, and the best way to treat it is to basically engage in self-harming behaviors with doctors and therapists' help.
So how long ago was this?
Pardon me?
How long ago?
Oh, so it was in the 70s. So it was a long time ago.
Were you,
It was before this whole narrative ever came up.
right.
And I have no doubt if I had been a child today that I would have been put on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and gotten a double mastectomy pretty darned early.
Right, right. And what was your parents' position on it?
Well, they followed the recommendations of the school psychologist, which were basically to try to expose me to strong female role models. So she suggested that they put me into Girl Scouts. They called it brownies or bluebirds, which is the Girl Scouts version of it. So to get me around other girls. And they also put me in a special program for kids with communication issues because I was very aggressive and I was rude to teachers and children, and I would push, I was watching the boys and I was trying to see, how can I be the boyish boy in the class, and trying to sort of overcompensate, and ended up being very aggressive. And so they put me in a special class with other kids who had communication issues, and all of these things were great ideas. And it breaks my heart now that a child like me now is told, oh yes, you were born in the wrong body.
Yes, exactly. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is the cross-cultural differences in the way that transgender is perceived. Because, if you follow the transgender argument, if gender is innate and it's very powerful and it's unchangeable, people all around the world should be experiencing their transgender selves in the same way. But they're in fact not. There are quite big discrepancies in different countries about the number of people who are identifying as transgender. And in a country like Iran, for example, they've latched on to transgenderism as a solution to homosexuality. So they think transgender is a much worse evil than being homosexual. And they're giving their young homosexual men two choices. One is to transgender, and the other is to be vilified or abandoned by their families or even executed.
Them being executed. So if your choice is to transition or be killed or completely ostracized, and this is what they're thinking is a cure for being gay. And it's amazing to me that here we are in America, in Australia, New Zealand, England, Canada, supporting this kind of belief.
Exactly. And so a lot of young homosexual men in Iran are running away they're leaving the country because, you know, they've been pushed into this terrible, you know, choice of having their bodies mutilated or having their bodies removed from them, you know, by being killed. So people use different philosophies in different ways, and depending on, you know, their underlying socio-cultural history and their belief systems and so on. So that's just an argument to show that nothing is ecologically isolated. You know, there's all of these other factors in different societies and communities and families that all impinge on the way that we perceive ourselves and our bodies and how we think about them, you know. So, you know, the argument for social influence, I mean, this is a psychic epidemic. I don't see any other way of describing it, that a lot of vulnerable, suggestible young people are jumping onto this train, this transgender train, because they think it's going to provide them with everything that they're missing in their lives right now. And because they're hurried into the transition process and then start questioning maybe a year or two later, they're expunged with intense rage and hatred by the group that was, you know, 5 minutes ago supporting them and affirming them. And then they're saying, you're not transgender, you never were, you know, you were pretending, so you're not one of us, so get out, you know. And so they're much worse off than they were before they started, because not only are they ostracised again and vilified and marginalised, but they've got this body that they don't know what to do with. And that's when the really serious mental health issues start to manifest. You know, the suicidality, the severe depression that some of them have. Yeah.
So Professor Kinney, I've looked through your blog, and you have a whole lot of really fascinating research, not just the paper we talked about at the beginning, but you've looked at rapid onset gender dysphoria. You've looked at a whole lot of different kind of perspectives on the transgender agenda. And I was just curious, how did you get involved in this?
Well, my specialty within the discipline of psychology is developmental and educational psychology. So most of my career has been concerned with the health, welfare and education of children. So that is my cognate and underlying discipline that informs my thinking. And I have a colleague who is a psychiatrist, and he had become involved in the whole debate because he's out and gay as a psychiatrist. So it's a very courageous thing that he's done. And he started getting these young people referred to him who were saying they were transgender. He said, look, I'm not a child psychiatrist. You know, I mainly work with adults, including young adults and other adults, but these children were getting younger and younger, and he kind of started to, we started to have some peer discussion about these cases, and, you know, we're sharing ideas about what is going on here and what are the underlying causes and what's happening in the family constellation and so on. And then he started referring these young people to me. So I built up a caseload of these young adolescents, you know, and I started working with them therapeutically and started to, you know, develop my own insights and comparing those insights with what I was seeing in the literature and with other colleagues. So we now have a support group, a peer group of like-minded clinicians, and we're a secret group because you may be aware of the absolute vilification of J.K. Rowling and so on. I've copped my fair share on Twitter. You know, I'm a transphobe and I'm doing irreparable damage to the transgender community and so forth. we are now sort of formulating theses and hypotheses about what's going on and how, you know, the condition should be treated and how we should be aware of what's happening socially. So that's what my latest paper is about, that social contagion is not just about these young people getting hooked in, but the legal system, education, medicine, sport, the media have all fallen in behind this transgender ideology without thinking, you know, without doing their own, you know, critical analysis of the agenda of this group and the science of it. And that's what alarms me more than anything, because children are now going to school and being told that they can choose. You know, even though they're a boy, now they can choose whether they're female or male, and they don't have to make a decision just yet. And this is horrifying because it really is confusing children. And, you know, some of them are going home to their parents distressed and said, "Mummy, my teacher said I mightn't be a girl, but I don't want to be a boy. I want to be a girl." These kinds of things. There's a book that's come out recently, an edited book by Heather Brunskill Evans and Michelle Moore. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called Creating the Transgender Child. And I've got a chapter in that book called Gender Development and the Transgendering of Children. And I critique the school policy in America where, you know, children are read nonsense books about gender fairies and gender unicorns and, you know, how they might look like a boy, but inside they're really a girl, those kinds of things. And they have transition ceremonies for children who, you know, are enrolled in school as male, and then they go behind a screen and change their clothes and come out as female. So I'm really angry with the people who should know better, including the Human Rights Commission, you know. So there are all these bodies that are supposed to set the agenda, you know, for keeping children safe and giving them a secure environment in which to grow and develop. And they've all crossed over into darkness.
So your background is in child development, and I have sort of a intuitive sense of what happens to a child when their parents and their doctors and their teachers and their crossing guard all lie to them. Can you kind of explain with your you know, knowledge, what is the impact going to be on this generation once they realize that all the adults in their lives have been lying to them?
Well, we're starting to see the effects of that now. There's a very high-profile case in the UK, a young woman called Kira Bell, who's about 23 now, and she's actually suing the gender identity clinic run by the NHS in the UK, which is the major purveyor of treatments for transgender children. And she's suing them because she said nobody took the time to sit down and explore with her what was going on. Nobody gave her space. She felt coerced into starting the puberty blockers and the cross-sex hormones. And now at 23, she's realised that she is a woman after all, but she's got no breasts and her body's been ravaged to some extent by the testosterone that she's been taking. And so her life has been irrevocably changed as a result of this experience. So some young people who had the support and the wherewithal are now going to express their rage through the courts. But others are going to suffer a profound loss of trust in the world. The world is not a safe place. There are no adults that I can turn to get the truth, whatever that truth is, you know, or to help me explore my own truth, so to speak. So they'll feel betrayed and they'll feel used and abused. And many of them are slipping into serious mental illness, have had their life trajectories derailed terribly, you know. They're too ill to continue with their studies. They're too ill to work. They're suffering constant side effects of the treatment, particularly those who've undergone
cross-sex surgery. Some of them, like I've read some papers that say that 30% of those who have this cross-sex surgery suffer serious complications and long-term side effects. There's a transgender man who publishes a lot on Twitter called Scott Nugent, and he details the horrific medical problems that he has as a result of the surgery. And he feels that his life is going to be shortened by these terrible complications that are resisting all forms of available treatment. And he's been a great advocate for non-transition of young people.
Well, and I'm thinking too,
you know,
and not only do they feel lied to and that there isn't an adult around, but we're also undermining their understanding of science, their ability to evaluate science. Like you mentioned at the beginning, these studies that are being put out there are really flawed, but it seems like we have a generation that isn't able to evaluate the validity of research. And we also have a whole generation basically being told that one of the very fundamental things about biology isn't true. And so I worry about what happens when we have a generation that throws out science and says that feelings are more important than empirical truth.
Absolutely. And as an academic, I've been an academic for 31 years, I'm absolutely horrified that the peak journals like The Lancet and Nature actually have made transgender supportive statements in their journals. And I think that is, of everything that horrifies me about this whole situation, I don't think I'm more horrified than the world's greatest scientists have actually renounced, you know, the binary nature of sex and these fundamental biological truths. The other thing that I see happening is the peak bodies of medical practitioners like the Paediatric Society and the Royal Australian College and the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists endorsed the transgender mythology, and then very quietly last year actually withdrew their support, but their withdrawal was nowhere near as publicised as their affirmation of the transgender lobby. So unless we get these peak bodies and these top scientific journals to say, hold on everyone, let's just look at the facts, let's just look at hundreds of years of science in studying the human organism, and let's get our facts straight at the very least. Until they do that, all of this nonsense is going to continue to be propagated. It's almost the same as the witch hunt, you know, witch hunts during the Middle Ages, where all these poor hapless women were burnt at the stake for being witches, and they had the most ridiculous tests, you know, to find out if you were a witch or not. And it's the same thing with transgender. It's no different. So it horrifies me, like you're saying, what about these young people who can't trust any adults to tell them the truth? I feel like I'm being betrayed by the World Health Organization, the Human Rights Commission, the Lancet, Nature, the specialist medical colleges,
the UN
and societies, because none of them have had the so that's why it's taken such a hold. And the legislation, you know, that's going around my country, it's all gay conversion therapy ban, you know, and what they call gay conversion, they've dropped the gay, conversion therapy is where you engage in open-ended exploratory psychotherapy to help the young person understand who they are. That's considered conversion therapy. And Queensland, a state in Australia, has just passed legislation where a doctor or a psychotherapist will be fined $30,000 and be subjected to 18 months jail if they're found to be practicing what the trans lobby defines as conversion therapy.
Which is just
So that's how
horrifying.
mad it's got in
Yeah.
Australia.
And that's one of the things that I think about, is that my school psychologist now likely would be charged with conversion therapy because she helped me to find some ways to manage my dysphoria and dysmorphia rather than affirming me. And it just is, it's shocking to me that this is happening. And I know the UN Special Rapporteur has talked about, I guess, I'm not sure what his full title is, but he's talked about wanting to ban conversion therapy internationally. But his definition is anybody who doesn't affirm the child, including parents. So we're talking about perhaps charging
Exactly.
parents.
Yes, absolutely. Parents have got almost no rights in Australia if they've got a transgender identifying child. And in fact, if they take their child to a gender clinic and they're saying to the gender so-called specialist, look, I'm really worried about this. I don't want my child to rush into it. It's a big decision. They're saying, you're the problem. Just get out of the child's way. We don't want to deal with you. We only want to deal with the child, and marginalise the parents. And I have a lot of parents coming to me saying, the therapists and the doctors, they won't talk to us. They won't tell us what's going on. And the courts are always coming down on the side of the 14 and 15-year-old who wants to do a double mastectomy.
It is
I've never seen a court. It really is. It really is. Yeah. So we're in the middle of madness.
We are. And Professor, I know that you need to get going. As we finish up here, is there anything that you would like to add that we didn't get a chance to talk about?
Look, I just want to say a very quick word about what's happening to women's sport, with trans females being admitted to female sport. And there's been some very disastrous things happen. I don't know if you know of a transgender boxer called Fallon Fox.
Who
Well, he smashed in the skull, of another boxer. And the boxer who he nearly permanently damaged for life said she had never felt so overwhelmed and so overpowered, by fighting with what is really a male who is identifying as female. That person is not a female. And this is what's happening in sport now, that women's sport is just going to be dominated by trans females because they've got bigger muscle groups, and reducing their testosterone isn't going to equal the playing field. And so there are a lot of feminist groups and a lot of sporting bodies who are very concerned about the implications of, this transgender policy on what's going to happen to women's sport, which they have fought so hard, to get their own place in the sun with respect to sport. And now it looks like, there are going to be major inroads into that space. And women are very, very worried about that.
Well, and that's what's so confounding when I think about a lot of feminists are supporting the trans agenda, and it's incredibly confusing to me because we've fought so hard to have women's sports, to have separate safe facilities for women, changing rooms and locker rooms, and all of that is being undermined, and scholarships for women and girls, and all of these things are being taken away from us. And oftentimes, at least here in the US, people who claim to be feminists, women who claim to be feminists, are supporting this, and it doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, interestingly, it has split the feminist agenda, because there's a group of feminists who are now being labelled TERFs. Have you heard of that?
Yes. I think
Trans-excluded radical feminists.
Yes.
Yeah. And these are women who are just simply saying that women are women and men are men. They're people who are sort of following the science, but now that's what they're labelled. And the feminists have split on this question, about whether they should be inclusive of trans females into female spaces. So there's a huge war going on there now in the sporting sector.
And prisons. I don't know if it's
Yeah,
happening where you are, but we also have a lot of activists fighting to allow males who identify as female into prisons with women, which is just a disaster.
Yes,
I mean,
yes. Uh-huh.
so
Absolutely.
do you have any positive, is there any good news or light at the end of the tunnel, or do you just feel like we really are entrenched in this battle and we need to do everything we can to fight it?
I tend to be pessimistic by nature. I don't have a great deal of confidence in Homo sapiens, the purveyors of world wars and racism and bigotry and misogyny and ruination of the planet, etc. But I have to say that for the first time in my academic life, I've found a group of truly wonderful colleagues who what's happening in this transgender space, and who are all working together from around the world to try and bring some sanity back into the debate about sexuality, sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's the one big positive. The other one I see is that there's starting to be a slow decrease, not in the number of children necessarily who are being referred to gender clinics, but the gender clinics are running scared because we've really built up a head of steam in terms of getting our message out there. And I've been noticing that fewer young people who are referred to the clinics are actually being placed on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. So those numbers, it's small at the moment, but I can see when I plot curves of data that I've got from the NHS and from Australia, and even a clinic in Sweden has shown this slight downward trajectory. So I'm hoping that we may have turned a small corner, but the big corner is going to depend on the legislature, the medical profession, education and sporting bodies. And until we get those people to realise what a terrible thing they've done to a whole generation of adolescents, I think it will burn out eventually, but I'd prefer it to burn out before another 100,000 young people have ruined their lives. But I don't know if that is possible at this point.
Well, Professor Kenny, thank you so much for your work. And I'm going to link to your blog in the description of this, because I was reading through your work. I'm familiar with the U.S. People who are writing about this, Michael Laidlaw and Lisa Marciano and Sasha Ayad. But you have really a nice body of work and I'll also try and link to that book that you mentioned that you have an article in. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Great. You're most welcome.